This video describes some new jigs which were printed on a 3D printer to enable a more accurate and easier alignment of the segment wedges when gluing up segmented rings. Hello, I'm John Manura. In a recent video I mentioned I've developed some new techniques for gluing up segmented wood turning pieces. I've been doing segmented wood turning now for about 10 years, and that time I've continually improved my techniques for gluing up my segments. When I first started out I was using these worm gear clamps, and they worked pretty well. I probably had 100 or 200 of these clamps, and eventually I filled up with glue, and they were unusable after a while. And so that's one main issue with these clamps, that you got to continue to clean them and keep all the glue off the systems. And when I was changed to epoxy cement, then these became really unusable. But the main reason they don't work that well is because of the worm gear itself. Right at this point where the worm gear is, it tends to push down this one segment further in towards the center of the disc. So you end up with an inaccurate segmented disc. And also the disc may not be perfectly round because of that. So these didn't work that well. And I went to a technique that I wanted to get continuous even pressure around the whole circumference of my segmented glue up pieces. And that's why I went to rubber bands. These rubber bands work pretty good. They give you a nice even pressure around the whole piece of segmented disc. And for the most part they work pretty good, but they can still be off a little bit as far as being totally symmetric. So then I added some center pieces. These are some round disc I cut and shaped to the exact inside diameter of my disc to keep it perfectly round. And that definitely improved the system even further. So there's two ways to keep the disc circular. One is to put a form inside, the other would be put a form on the outside. A form on the outside is a little more difficult, but the form on the inside works pretty good for this application. So I went to that technique. That worked pretty well. And then, especially with techniques where you have a perfectly round disc with no center point, these rubber bands work really good, giving you a nice, straight, accurate segmented disc. But I see there's better ways to even do this. And recently I added 2 3D printers to my shop. And these 3D printers have been invaluable in developing some new techniques and new jigs and accessories for my shop. New jigs for my Accu-Slice and Accu-Wedge systems, and new techniques or new jigs for tool holding and various other processes I use in my shop. I've been making a lot of accessories for my shop using a 3D printer. So I got the idea to develop some new jigs for doing my segmented wood turning. Techniques such as this using a center plate. And now, right now I'm in the process of making some segmented disc. These segmented discs have 36 pieces of wood with 36 spaces in between each of those spacers. So there's actually 72 pieces of wood in the segmented disc. And I'll be using epoxy to glue these up because I need a lot of setup time to glue up all these segmented wedges. So I wanted to use a center plate much like this, and my thought was to use a pin, to go through the center, matching the exact inside diameter of my segmented disc. And that way I can force these pieces in towards the center and get a nice symmetrical form for my piece that isn't warped or smashed. Because if you don't have a center piece, you can actually see these things can actually be pushed in, give you an inaccurate shape. But by using a center pin, I can get that round shape much better and get it more accurate. And I mount this pin on a plate. Again, this is a 3D printed plate. And by having it on a plate, I can push it down as well as pushing it around. And I can eliminate any of this, angling of the segments, get them nice and straight, and then clamp them down and get a nice, symmetrical, straight segmented disc. So I'll be testing out these new jigs that I just developed for segmented wood turning for the glue-ups. So I'm always looking for new and better ways to make my glue-ups more accurate and easier. I use the Accu-Wedge system on my bandsaw to slice the segments for the wood segmented disc for this project. I set the Accu-Wedge system to slice 36 walnut wood segments per segmented disc. The board that I started with was 3/4 inches wide by 1.5 inches thick by 18 inches long. I had adjusted the Accu-Wedge system to slice wedges that were 1/8 inch thick on the outside edge and tapered to a point on the inside edge of the segments. I sliced enough wedges to provide me with enough pieces to assemble 5 segmented discs. Afterwards I inserted 36.020 inch thick maple wood spacers between each of the wedges. I took care to cut each of these maple wood spacers the exact width and thickness of the walnut wood segment wedges. This will provide for segmented discs with 72 pieces of wood in each segmented disc. These are the 5 resulting segmented wood pieces on their glue-up jigs ready for glue-up. The center pin glue-up jigs for the segmented disc were designed using the Fusion 360 software. The design is fairly simple. The bottom plate is 3.0 inches in diameter, and the diameter of the center pin is 0.450 inches for this example. Other diameters of the center pin were also made, which vary from 0.40 inches in diameter up to 0.550 inches in diameter. The base was extruded to 0.25 inches thick, and the center pin height was extruded to 2.0 inches tall. The top of the center pin was then rounded. From the Fusion 360 software, I generated the STL file for the 3D printing of this model, and this file was then imported into the Bamboo 3D printer software. In the Bamboo 3D printer software, I downloaded 4 of the center pin glue-up jigs with different diameter center pins, and then proceeded to print them on the Bamboo 3D printer. This is a sped-up view of the actual printing of the 4 center pin glue-up jigs. I made a wide range of these glue-up jigs for this project, and I made them of different diameters. I went from as small as 0.425 inch diameter pin up to a 0.525 inch diameter pin, because I wanted different diameter pins depending on what size the inside of my segmented disc ended up being. Initially the segmented disc fit on a 0.450 diameter pin, but I thought with the additional glue they might change, it might expand, so that's why I made some additional larger sizes. But it turned out that didn't happen. They actually all stayed at 0.450. And these were all designed in the Fusion 360 software, printed out with my 3D printer. And I actually printed out the size on each of these so I know exactly what they are in the future. So I actually etched in the dimension of the diameter of the pin. Once again, I'm using the West epoxy system for this project. I prefer using the epoxy glue for gluing my segmented disc for 2 reasons. First of all, this epoxy has a setup time of 30 to 45 minutes. This gives me enough time to set up in the line 10 to 100 wedges for a segmented disc before the epoxy cement starts to harden. Secondly, since the epoxy glue is not water-based, the epoxy cement does not expand the wood fibers of the wedges. This eliminates the problem of expanding and shrinking of the segments that I've encountered when using a Titebond water-based glue. This will reduce the chance of cracking and splitting of the joints between the individual segments. After thoroughly mixing the epoxy, I'm ready for gluing the 72 segments and spacers. I'm applying the epoxy glue to both sides of the walnut wedges and maple spacers. I also make sure that I alternate the silver marks on top of the walnut wedges. After the wood pieces have been coated with the epoxy glue, I place them on the center pin glue-up jig and push them against the center pin on the jig. I continue this process until all the segments and spacers have been glued. It took me about 20 minutes to glue up all the wedges and spacers for this segmented disc. I then used some small rubber bands to clamp the wedges and spacers together to form the cylindrical shape and squeeze out some of the excess glue. Afterwards, I did an initial alignment of all the wedges and spacers, making sure they all are pushed against the center pin of the jig and that all the wedges are aligned on the outside of the circumference of the assembly and the wedges are straight vertically. I also made a small wooden tool to enable me to push the individual wedges so that they all are positioned flat down against the 3-inch diameter base plate of the center glue-up jig. I continue to add additional rubber bands and apply more pressure to the joints between the wedges and spacers and squeeze out more of the excess epoxy. At various times during this glue-up, I removed the segmented assembly from the glue-up jig, wiped off the excess epoxy, and then reattached the assembly to the glue-up jig. I also once again confirmed that all the wedges were perfectly aligned against the center pin and that none of the wedges were pushed too far or not enough. I continued to add some more rubber bands. I then removed the glued-up assembly from the glue-up jig, wiped off the excess epoxy, and then reattached the assembly onto the glue-up jig to make sure nothing had moved. Finally, I removed the assembly from the glue-up jig and set it aside where it will dry and cure overnight. I just finished 3 of these segmented discs using this new jig, and I did come up with a couple conclusions. First of all, the spacers need to be exactly the same size as the segments. And because being sticking up, like these stick up a little bit, you can see that on this, they actually stick up a little bit. That made an issue with trying to get these aligned. So I have 3 more of these ready to go, and I just got these, I redid the inserts so they're all now exactly the same height as the disc. And I also shortened the length so they're no longer the disc. So they don't stick above the segments and they don't stick out above the segments. So that makes it much easier to align. So that's the one change that I'm making. The other thing I saw, I was doing some alignment, adjusting the height of these, and it's best to do that before you put too many rubber bands on. So I just put like maybe 1 or 2 rubber bands on, do the adjustment, make sure you're all cleaned up, get rid of a lot of the excess epoxy, and then put more rubber bands on, and then get rid of the excess epoxy. But getting these aligned before you put too many rubber bands on, because once you put a lot of rubber bands on, it's harder to adjust them. So it's best to adjust these before you put too many rubber bands on. So those are the main 2 changes, making sure that these thin inserts are exactly the same dimensions as the wedges, and aligning before you put a lot of pressure on. The other thing with these wedges, I made these wedges come into a perfect point. It'd be better if these had a little bit of meat on the end. They weren't quite to a perfect point because they're pretty fragile, and I had 1 or 2 crack on me right on the end, especially when I'm pushing them in towards this spacer. I had a couple actually split out and crack on me. So I want to make those in the future. I'll make these with a little bit of meat on the end, not a perfect point. The perfect point is good for, for making segmented discs to go to a perfect point in the center. That's where they come in handy. But for these, I do want a little bit of a flat end on the tapered end of these segments. So that works much better. So there are the main 3 changes I'm making. So let me go and finish up the last 3 of these. I have 3 more ready to go. And we'll glue those up now. And the main change now is these are all the same height. All the segments and the inserts are all the same dimensions. I use the same process as I used previously to glue up these segmented discs, applying epoxy to both sides of the wedges and spacers, line them against the segment and jig, and then after they've all been glued up, I'll attach rubber bands around them to position them and hold them in place. Squeeze out the excess epoxy, add more rubber bands, again squeeze out more of the epoxy and wipe off my jig to get rid of the excess epoxy, put it back on the jig. Double check my alignment, make sure everything's perfectly aligned. Add more rubber bands. Yeah, squeeze out more of the excess epoxy, wipe it off again, remove from the jig, wipe off the excess epoxy once again, and just continue this process, adding rubber bands and wiping off the excess epoxy. Well, that alignment of these pieces was much easier with these thin inserts being the same dimensions as the segmented disc. Just the alignment was just right on with no need to do much adjustment, if any. Everything nice down, flat, flush. The other advantage of using epoxy is these pieces of wood did not expand at all. In other words, these segmented discs fit on this block, which has a diameter of, the diameter on this, I think it's 0.45 inches. Yeah, 0.45 inches diameter. It fit on just perfect before I put the glue on, and after I put the glue on, it's the exact same dimension. If I had used Type-On glue, these would have expanded and I would have needed a bigger insert. So they didn't change dimensions at all, which is good. Which just goes to show that the wood's not absorbing the glue like Type-On. Yeah, Type-On would absorb very quickly because it's water-based. Since the epoxy is not water-based, it doesn't absorb it. And that's perfect. Okay, I'll put 1 more rubber band on, and then we'll call this one done. Customers always ask me where I get my rubber bands from. They're available from Uline online. They have a wide selection of different diameters and thicknesses of rubber bands, so that's a great place to get your rubber bands from. And there's that one completed. You see those inserts are below the surface of the segments. And everything nice and straight and perfectly circular. So I do take this off. I don't leave it on the block. If I left it on a block, it would glue in place. You never get it off. So nothing's moving now. I can clean this up. And I use some isopropyl alcohol to remove the epoxy before it hardens. The isopropyl alcohol will take off the epoxy before it hardens. After it hardens, of course, it won't take it off. But I can do it now. It cleans it up nicely, and I keep reusing these blocks. These 6 segmented discs now are all finished. They've all been glued up and allowed to dry overnight. As I described earlier, each contains 72 pieces of wood in each of the segmented disc. And now I need to take this over to my wire wheel to get rid of the rubber bands. then on my sander to smooth out the surfaces and round off the corners. Rubber bands are glued to the surface of segmented disc with the epoxy cement. I found that the best way to remove the rubber bands from the segmented disc is by using a wire wheel mounted on a grinder stand. Only light pressure is required to shred the rubber bands off the surface of the segmented disc. Okay, I'm ready to sand these segmented disc on my 2-inch belt sander. And I'm first of all sanding these flat surfaces to get them perfectly flat, get everything straight and flat. And then I'll be rounding off the corners. Not to take much off on this outside edge, just because I don't want to change the shape. I want to keep it perfectly cylindrical. But I do want to round off the corners and get rid of the excess glue. So just a light sanding an outside surface and flattening the top and bottom surfaces. And the purpose of the sanding isn't to make these perfect, just to get rid of most of the glue so there's no glue, major glue on the surfaces, and also making sure none of these thin spacers stick beyond the outside surface. Because I want to use this later to put in a jig. It needs to be perfectly round. So just rounding off the corners and making sure none of these spacers stick out above the surface. And most of the excess glue off. Because when I put this on my disc sand, or my Accu-Slice blade, I'll be slicing off thin sections, so I'll be actually cutting off, 25 thousandths off the surface. This concludes this video on the testing of these new jigs for gluing up the segmented disc. And these new jigs actually work quite nice. I did use epoxy for gluing these up. So when I first set these up, they were dry and they fit on my jig. In this case it was a .450 diameter pin disc, and they fit on there perfect. And after gluing up, they fit on the same exact pin. The wood did not change in dimension with using the epoxy. Had I used Type-On glue, I would have needed to use a larger pin, and that's why I made some larger different sizes here. I went from actually a .425 up to a .525, because I didn't know how the diameter of this hole might change as the glue was added to the segmented disc. But they didn't change at all. These fit on the same pin before I started and after I started, the exact same .450 inch diameter pin. But I did make these different sizes up. I'll probably be using these in the future for other projects, because depending on the dimensions of your segmented disc, the inside diameter could change very easily. I did make one additional change after sanding these. I sanded the outside surfaces briefly just to smooth off the two ends and get rid of the excess glue on the outside and make sure none of these thin sections were extending beyond the surface of the circumference of the segmented disc. But I want to clean up the inside, so I made just use a piece of dowel wood, just about probably a 3/8 inch diameter dowel, and I used a small piece of sandpaper to wrap around that, and you just lightly sand the inside of these to get rid of the excess glue in the inside. So these all now fit perfectly on my pin. So I may be using a disc or a jig much like this when I use this in the next video, because in the next video I'll be taking some of these segmented discs, I'll be slicing them into thin sections and then gluing them back together, rotating each one a half a segment. And I'll be using a jig like this to glue them back together so I get perfect alignment of the segmented disc as I glue them back together. So that's why I want these to fit exactly on this pin. So that video will be coming shortly on part 2 with a new jig, either this jig or a very similar jig for gluing up the segmented disc. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, as always, please give us a call or drop us an email. And thank you once again. The center pin glue-up jigs demonstrated in this video are not commercially available because they need to be printed out to the exact dimensions of your particular project. If you're an avid woodworker, I would highly recommend the addition of a 3D printer to your shop so you could print out these glue-up jigs specifically dimensioned for your projects. Several of our customers already are using 3D printers to add accessories, tools, and jigs to their shop.